You know, when most of us picture drowning, we imagine this very specific, like, dramatic scene.
Oh, totally. Like the movie version.
Right. It's always what we see in the movies. Someone is thrashing around in the middle of a vast ocean and they're slipping beneath the waves, just, completely swallowed by the deep. It feels like this massive, full-body event.
Yeah, exactly. We think of it as sinking into the abyss, but the medical reality is actually far more localized and honestly a lot more chilling.
Right. And we've got a pretty formidable stack of sources on the table today. Dense forensic pathology textbooks, historical medical journals, detailed autopsy reports. And the very first thing that just jumped out at me from these medical forensics is that you don't actually need to be fully submerged to drown.
Yeah, that's a huge misconception.
It really is. Just having the nose and mouth covered by fluid for a sufficient period, like even in a shallow puddle or a ditch, is enough to trigger a fatal chain reaction.
It's wild, right? It completely rewrites our understanding of the mechanics of asphyxiation.
Yeah.
I mean, it proves it's not about the depth of the water around you, but the specific blockage of your airway.
Right. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore the surprisingly complex, microscopic, and forensic reality of drowning. Because it's not just what you see on screen, it's a biological chain reaction that leaves behind a fascinating, highly specific trail of clues inside the human body.
Yeah, and whether you're a true crime enthusiast or maybe a medical science nerd or just someone listening right now who wants to understand the absolute limits of the human body, this deep dive is going to completely change how you view a seemingly simple phenomenon.
A phenomenon that tragically claims about 150,000 lives globally every year.
It's a staggering number.
It really is. So, okay, let's unpack this by starting with the definitions. Because drowning is fundamentally a form of asphyxia, which simply means, preventing oxygen from reaching the blood. The textbooks show it can happen in several distinct ways. It's not just one single biological event.
Right, exactly. The classic scenario most people imagine is what forensics calls wet drowning, or primary drowning.
Yeah.
That's where water is physically inhaled directly into the lungs, and that eventually leads to cardiac arrest.
Right.
But, that is just one category.
And here is where I really got stuck in the reading. The sources mention something called dry drowning, which accounts for like 10 to 20% of cases. And they say water never actually enters the lungs, like at all. I don't get it. How does someone drown without water in their lungs?
Yeah, it sounds like an oxymoron, right?
Okay.
But it comes down to a hyperactive defensive reflex. So when water suddenly hits the nasopharynx or the larynx, so your upper airway, it triggers a sudden, sustained laryngeal spasm.
A spasm.
Yeah, your airway just violently locks shut to protect your delicate lungs from the water.
Wait, but if it locks shut to protect the lungs, shouldn't the person just, I don't know, pass out from lack of air, and then their muscles relax, the spasm breaks, and they start breathing again? Why does it actually kill them?
That is the exact logical paradox.
Yeah.
And it's why dry drowning is so insidious. You're completely right that normally when you pass out, your muscles relax. But in these specific cases, the spasm is so severe and the neurological feedback loop is so intense that the vocal cords refuse to open back up in time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the brain is deprived of oxygen for too long before the muscles ever get the signal to relax. So, ironically, the body's own defense mechanism against the water causes death by asphyxia. The water doesn't kill you. Your own locked airway does.
Wow. The body is so desperate to keep the water out that it literally suffocates itself.
Precisely. Now, if you contrast that with secondary drowning, which is also known as near drowning or post-immersion syndrome, it's a totally different story.
Okay, how so?
Well, this is a scenario where a person is pulled from the water, resuscitated, and survives the initial event. They might even seem perfectly fine, sitting up, talking, coughing a little.
But they aren't out of the woods yet, are they? Because the sources mention this delayed chemical firestorm. They use terms like chemical pneumonitis and metabolic acidosis. What is actually happening in their chest, like hours later?
Think about the chemicals in a swimming pool, right? Like chlorine, or that bacteria in a lake. When even a small amount of that gets into the lungs, it severely irritates the delicate tissue.
So it's not about the volume of water anymore?
Exactly. Chemical pneumonitis is essentially a massive inflammation of the lungs. The pool chemicals strip away the protective lining of your air sacs. And because that lining is damaged, fluid from your own bloodstream slowly begins to leak into your lungs over the next several hours.
So you are slowly drowning in your own body's fluids long after you've left the water. Like you could literally drown in your own bed.
Yes, it's terrifying. That fluid buildup blocks oxygen exchange. and that leads to severe electrolyte disturbances and secondary metabolic acidosis.
Which just means your blood becomes dangerously acidic because your body can't clear out the carbon dioxide, right?
You got it. Now, if you're listening to this and wondering if that time you choked on pool water means you're at risk, don't panic. You have to inhale a medically significant amount to trigger this cascade, not just a sputtering cough. But it absolutely requires strict medical observation.
That makes a lot of sense. Which actually brings me to the strangest category I found in the journals, immersion syndrome, or hydrocution. It only accounts for 1 to 2% of cases. The texts say it involves vagal inhibition. So, is immersion syndrome essentially the body's electrical system short-circuiting out of pure shock rather than a plumbing issue of water filling the pipes?
That is a perfect analogy. Yes, it is purely electrical. Death results from a sudden, massive cardiac arrest triggered by nothing more than the profound shock of cold water hitting the skin or striking the abdomen, or even cold water rapidly entering the eardrums.
Just from the cold.
Yeah. The nervous system just panics. The vagus nerve overreacts and sends this massive slowdown signal to the heart, and the heart just stops instantly. No water needs to be inhaled at all. It often happens when someone inexperienced dives horizontally and belly flops into freezing water.
Oh, man. But here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let's go back to that first type, wet drowning, where the water does breach the defenses and actually fills the lungs, because the actual mechanism of death, the way the body shuts down, is entirely dependent on the type of water you're in.
Right. Freshwater and seawater wage completely different biological wars.
Exactly. I had no idea.
Yeah, the pathophysiology is entirely dictated by osmosis and salinity. So let's look at freshwater first. Freshwater, like a lake or a pool, has a very low salt concentration, about 0.6% sodium chloride.
And your blood is much saltier than that.
Way saltier. So when freshwater enters the alveoli, the tiny air sacs in the lungs, it doesn't just sit there. The pulmonary alveolar lining is semi-permeable.
So because of osmosis, the water wants to dilute the saltier environment, meaning the fresh water gets rapidly absorbed from the lungs directly into the bloodstream.
Exactly. And the speed of this is terrifying. The sources show that up to 2.5 liters of water can be absorbed into the blood in just 3 minutes.
2.5 liters?
Yeah.
In 3 minutes?
Yes. It causes massive hemodilution, meaning your blood is suddenly watered down to dangerously thin levels.
And the textbooks say this does 2 catastrophic things. The first involves something called surfactant. Can you explain that?
Sure. Think of surfactant like the anti-stick spray in a frying pan. It's a slippery substance that coats your tiny air sacs, keeping them from sticking together and collapsing when you exhale.
Okay.
So when 2.5 liters of fresh water washes into the lungs, it strips that anti-stick spray right out. The air sacs collapse and literally glue shut, making oxygen exchange impossible.
And the second catastrophic thing happens to the blood cells themselves, right? Because if fresh water makes our blood so thin and watery, do the red blood cells just absorb it all? Like, do they swell up like overfilled water balloons and pop?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. It's called hemolysis. The red blood cells burst, and when they burst, they release all their internal contents directly into the bloodstream, particularly potassium.
Oh, and potassium is a big deal for the heart.
Huge deal. It's a potent myocardial toxin. This sudden massive spike in serum potassium hyperkalemia hits the heart like a hammer, causing fatal ventricular fibrillation. The heart muscle loses its rhythm and just quivers uselessly.
That is incredibly violent at a microscopic level. So what happens in the ocean then? Because I always assumed salt water was worse because salt dehydrates you. How does that work in the lungs?
You're actually on the right track with the dehydration part. Seawater is hypertonic, meaning it's over 3% salt, which is much saltier than your blood. So the osmotic gradient is entirely reversed.
So instead of water rushing into the blood.
Right. The highly salty seawater sitting in the lungs acts like a sponge, drawing fluid out of your bloodstream and into your lungs.
Meaning your lungs literally fill up with your own blood plasma. That's a massive pulmonary edema.
Right. And because the blood is losing all its water into the lungs, it becomes incredibly thick and sludgy. This is hemoconcentration.
So your heart is trying to pump mud, basically.
Basically, yeah. Your heart is suddenly trying to pump this highly viscous, thick sludge through your veins, leading to rapid heart failure and myocardial anoxia, which is oxygen starvation of the heart muscle. So in fresh water, the blood gets too thin and toxic. But in salt water, the blood gets too thick and the lungs drown in drawn-out body weight.
If the mechanisms are so different, does that mean you die faster in a lake than in the ocean?
It does. Fresh water is about twice as lethal in terms of speed. The saddle period for complete submersion in fresh water is generally about 4 to 5 minutes.
Wow, that fast.
Yeah. And for seawater, because it takes longer to draw fluid out of the blood than it does for fresh water to burst the cells, it takes about 8 to 10 minutes.
To figure this exact timeline out, the historical medical journals cite some pretty intense animal experiments. There's one by a researcher named Brouardel who used dogs.
Yes, the late 19th century experiments. They were foundational, if, quite grim. Brodel submerged dogs in fresh water and meticulously recorded the stages. He noted the initial surprise and deep breath holds, followed by involuntary deep gasping, then convulsions, and finally terminal gasps.
And how long did that take?
In fresh water, that entire sequence took only 3 to 4 minutes. But when they repeated the exact same experiment using seawater, it took almost twice as long for the dogs to expire.
That is brutal. But there was another experiment mentioned from 1965 by a researcher named Kylestra that really blew my mind. They submerged mice in physiological saline, so liquid that was perfectly matched to the saltiness of the mice's blood. But this liquid was highly oxygenated under pressure.
Yes, the liquid breathing experiment.
Yeah. And those mice survived completely submerged, breathing the liquid, for 18 hours.
18 hours. It's incredible.
What's fascinating here is what that actually proves. It proves that the fluid itself isn't the primary killer, right?
Exactly. It's the lack of oxygen, the extreme volume of the fluid, and the salinity mismatch that causes the fatal cascade. If you balance the salt and provide oxygen, the lungs can technically process liquid, at least for a while.
So summarizing the ultimate physiological causes of death from our sources, we're looking at a pretty brutal list. True asphyxia, ventricular fibrillation from the bursting blood cells in fresh water, laryngeal spasm in dry drowning, vagal inhibition from the cold shock, exhaustion, or even just blunt force injuries like hitting a rock on the way down.
Precisely. It's a combination of physical trauma, oxygen deprivation, and extreme chemical imbalance.
So knowing how quickly this all happens and the absolute chaos it causes in the blood, how does a forensic pathologist actually prove drowning after the fact? Because once the heart stops, the potassium levels normalize, the blood stops pumping. It sounds like the evidence just vanishes.
It is notoriously difficult. In fact, the diagnosis of drowning is often considered one of the hardest in all of forensic pathology. It's frequently a diagnosis of exclusion, but there are highly characteristic signs they look for, starting externally.
The autopsy reports mention one very specific external sign, a fine, white, lathery froth at the mouth and nostrils. Why is it frothy instead of just, water leaking out?
Remember the surfactant we talked about, the anti-sick spray?
Right.
Well, when the victim is struggling underwater, the water irritates the mucous membranes. The airways secrete thick mucus. The violent respiratory efforts mix that mucus, the inhaled water, the remaining air in the lungs, and that soapy surfactant into a really dense foam.
Like whipping up soap suds.
Exactly like that. And because the surfactant stabilizes these bubbles, they don't pop easily. You can literally touch them with a scalpel and they stay intact. If the pathologist wipes the froth away, it will often reappear if they gently press on the chest, forcing more out of the airways.
That is a haunting image. The texts also talk about finding cutis anserina, which is severe gooseflesh from the spasm of the skin muscles in cold water. But the one that gave me a visceral reaction was washerwoman hands and feet.
Oh yes, the maceration of the skin.
The skin becomes so wrinkled and sodden that after 2 to 4 days in the water, the entire outer layer of skin on the hands can completely peel off like a glove.
Yeah, it's called degloving.
Forensic teams sometimes have to slip those skin gloves over their own hands just to get a fingerprint, right?
They do. It's grim work, but essential for identification. However, the internal signs are where the story really gets confirmed. Finding water in the stomach happens in about 70% of cases. But even more telling is finding water deep in the small intestine, which happens about 20% of the time.
Because water in the intestine proves the person was alive and actually swallowing while in the water, right? It requires active peristalsis, that digestive muscle movement, to push it down there. A dead body dumped in a lake won't have water in its small intestine.
Exactly. It shows active biology. Then the pathologist opens the chest to look at the lungs. Remember the fresh versus seawater battleground. The lungs hold the physical receipt of that battle.
I found the contrast here fascinating. So freshwater lungs are completely ballooned with trapped air, but they are surprisingly light, only about double their normal weight. They're pale pink, and when you take them out of the chest cavity, they actually retain their shape, like they don't collapse. And when the pathologist cuts into them, they crackle a sound called crepitus.
Right, and that crepitus sound is the scalpel cutting through the destroyed, overdistended air sacs that have glued themselves shut after the surfactant was washed away. And because the fresh water was absorbed into the blood so quickly, very little fluid actually pours out when you cut them.
But seawater lungs are the complete opposite. They are also ballooned, but they are massively heavy, weighing up to 2 kilograms because of all the fluid drawn in from the blood.
Yeah, 2 whole kilograms.
They look purplish or bluish and feel soft and jelly-like. When you remove them and place them on an autopsy table, they just flatten out under their own weight. And when you cut into a seawater lung, there's no crackling. Instead, copious amounts of fluid and froth just pour out without even squeezing.
Looking at the lungs gives you an immediate macroscopic clue about the environment. But as we know, bodies aren't always found immediately.
Right. What if the body has been in the water for weeks? Putrefaction sets in, the tissue breaks down, and those specific macroscopic lung clues degrade. What is the microscopic backup plan?
Historically, forensic science relied on chemical tests. They used to do something called the Gettler test, which checked the chloride difference between the left and right sides of the heart. The theory was that fresh water absorbed into the blood would dilute the left heart's chloride, and salt water would increase it.
Makes sense in theory.
In theory, yes. But modern forensics considers this highly unreliable because chloride levels shift way too much after death.
So what do they use now? The textbooks mention testing for elevated levels of serum strontium. Why strontium?
Strontium is a naturally occurring trace element found in almost all bodies of water, both fresh and marine. It's not normally found in high levels in human blood. So if a pathologist finds elevated levels of serum strontium in the bloodstream, it proves that water entered the lungs, crossed the alveolar barrier, and circulated while the heart was still beating.
It's a chemical footprint.
Exactly. But even better than strontium is the ultimate forensic trump card: diatoms.
Diatoms. I love this part. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel.
They are incredible. Diatoms are microscopic, single-celled algae. There are about 25,000 species of them floating in almost all fresh and seawater. But what makes them special is that they secrete hard outer skeletons made of pure silica.
Glass, basically.
Right. Essentially, they live inside microscopic glass houses. They are practically indestructible. They resist extreme heat and strong acids.
And here is how they solve crimes, right? If a person is alive while they are drowning, their heart is still beating. As they inhale the water, along with these microscopic diatoms, crosses the torn lung tissue and gets pushed into the bloodstream.
Yes.
The beating heart then pumps these indestructible glass algae skeletons deep into the body's closed systems, like the brain, the liver, and the bone marrow.
Now think like a defense attorney for a moment. What if someone was murdered on land and the killer just dumped a dead body into a lake to stage a drowning?
Well, the water might passively seep into the lungs due to the pressure of the deep water. But because the heart isn't beating, the water and the diatoms cannot be pumped into the deep bone marrow.
Exactly. Finding diatoms deep inside the bone marrow of the femur is ironclad, undeniable proof that the person was breathing and their heart was pumping while they were in the water. Forensics can literally take a sample of human bone marrow and dissolve it in boiling nitric acid.
That is such a wild visual, boiling a human bone in acid just to find a microscopic clue.
It sounds extreme, but it works. All the human tissue dissolves entirely, but those silica diatom skeletons survive. Under a microscope, there are specific shapes. Some look like stars, some like crescents, some like incredibly intricate little boats, can even be matched to the specific body of water where the person drowned.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because different lakes have different diatom populations, investigators can confirm not just how they died, but exactly where.
So the diatoms give us an indestructible record of how and where they died. But in a real investigation, police also need to know when. If a body is found floating, how does a forensic team reverse engineer the timeline of when it actually went into the water? Which brings us to the physics of submersion and flotation. When someone drowns, why do they sink first?
It's purely a matter of specific gravity. The specific gravity of pure water is 1.0. The human body has a specific gravity of about 1.08, making us slightly denser, slightly heavier than fresh water. So gravity wins, and we sink. Well, it's worth noting that in very deep, highly salty water, like the Dead Sea or the deep ocean, the increased density of the water might keep a body suspended just under the surface without fully hitting the bottom.
But eventually they always float back up.
Yes, and this is where the timeline comes in. As natural putrefaction begins, bacteria in the gut and tissues break down the body and produce Gases methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide.
And those gases get trapped.
Right, they get trapped in the tissues and organs. They act like internal life jackets, eventually lowering the body's overall specific gravity until it becomes buoyant enough to rise to the surface.
And the timeline for this varies wildly based on the environment, right? The forensics manuals note that in the intense summer heat in India, a body might float in just 12 to 18 hours because the bacteria are in overdrive.
The heat accelerates everything.
Yeah. In the winter, it takes 18 to 36 hours. But in freezing cold countries, the bacterial action is slowed down so much that a body might not float for weeks or sometimes months.
The environment matters, but the body composition matters too. Women, children, and obese individuals tend to float sooner.
Because of body fat.
Exactly. Human fat has a specific gravity of 0.92. It's significantly lighter than water. The higher the body fat percentage, the faster the body achieves natural buoyancy once those gases start forming.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive by saying you don't even need to be fully submerged to drown. And looking at this massive stack of forensic evidence, we see that drowning is so much more than a simple lack of air. It is a wildly complex biological cascade.
It really is.
It's osmotic shock popping blood cells like water balloons, it's lung surfactant being washed away, and it's a microscopic invasion of glass-housed algae that tells a highly specific, undeniable story of a victim's final moments.
It really is a marvel of, albeit tragic, biology. But I want to leave you with a final, slightly eerie thought to ponder.
Oh, lay it on me.
We just talked about diatoms, those microscopic algae with silica skeletons so tough they can survive boiling forensic acid in extreme heat. Millions of them exist in the water we swim in, and frankly, the water we inadvertently swallow every single day.
Oh, I see where you're going with this.
It makes you wonder. Long after our bodies break down in the earth, long after our bones turn to dust and completely disappear, could the indestructible skeletons of the microscopic life we casually swallowed at the beach be the only permanent geological record that we were ever here?
That is, wow, haunting and strangely beautiful. If you're listening right now, next time you're at the beach, just remember that invisible world you're swimming in. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the science behind the everyday world around you, and we'll catch you next time.